"Where's the dog?" That was the first thing Sergeant First Class Brianne Holt said when she came back to consciousness. Not "where am I?" Not what happened. Not even "it hurts." Just that. 3 words dry as sand before her eyes had fully opened. The nurse standing over her didn't know what to say. Brianne Holt had been a combat medic for 11 years before a roadside IED outside Kandahar took the lower half of her left leg and, for a long time, most of her will to stay in this world. She came back to the States in a wheelchair, then on crutches, then on a prosthetic that clicked faintly when she walked too fast. She adjusted. That was what she did. That was, in many ways, the only thing she'd ever been good at. Reading a situation, finding the edges of it, and adjusting. The dog's name was Corpsman. She hadn't named him. The rescue organization had a small group out of Baton Rouge that matched retired military working dogs with veterans who needed them. When they handed her his leash in the parking lot of a strip mall in Shreveport on a Tuesday afternoon, they told her he'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan, been embedded with a Marine unit, and had a mild sensitivity to loud noises that sometimes made him pace at night. They said he'd been trained to detect the chemical signature of cortisol spikes, the body's signal that a panic attack was coming, before the person themselves even knew it was happening. Brianne had looked at him. He was a Belgian Malinois, brindle and serious, with a scar along his right ear that nobody had explained. He looked up at her with the particular expression of a creature who has seen enough of the world to know when he's looking at a kindred spirit. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in about 4 years. She just took the leash, thanked the woman from the organization, and drove home. That was 8 months ago. By now, Corpsman slept at the foot of her bed, ate at a certain time each morning, and went with her everywhere that the ADA required businesses to allow him, and a few places it didn't. He had a vest, official-looking, orange and black, and most people, when they saw it, gave them space. Every now and then someone would crouch down to pet him without asking, and Brianne would say, very calmly, "Please don't, he's working," and the person would look embarrassed and stand back up. She'd gotten a part-time job at a VA clinic in Hammond, Louisiana. Not clinical work, her hands weren't steady enough after the blast injury for that, and she'd come to terms with it, but administrative, checking people in, scheduling appointments, making sure veterans who'd waited months for a referral didn't get lost in the system. It was quiet work, the kind that let her mind stay at a low hum instead of a scream, and she liked it more than she expected to. On the evening of a Thursday in late October, she left the clinic at 6:15. The parking lot sat on the side of the building, poorly lit in the way that most VA facilities seem to be, as if the architects had assumed the patients inside would be too weary to notice. There were maybe a dozen cars left. Her truck was near the back, which she preferred. She didn't like being blocked in. Corpsman walked at her left side, matching her pace exactly, occasionally glancing up at her the way he did when he was monitoring something she wasn't aware of yet. She noticed the man before Corpsman did. He was standing between 2 cars about 30 feet away, mid-40s, heavy jacket, standing too still. Something about the stillness. Brianne had spent enough time in places where stillness meant danger to read it without having to think about it. She slowed down. Corpsman's ears went flat. Later, she would try to reconstruct the next 40 seconds into something linear, something that made sense in the order it happened, and she'd never quite manage it. What she remembered was this. The man moved toward them faster than she expected, saying something she didn't catch. Corpsman stepped in front of her. Not trained to do that, just did it, the way good dogs sometimes exceed their programming. She had her hand on his vest. She was saying something too, she thought. Words she couldn't remember later. Then there was a pull at the leash, and she understood somehow that the man was trying to take him, not just get around him, but actually take the dog, yank the leash from her hand and go. She did not let go. She would not be able to explain this afterward in any way that sounded rational. She could have let go. She should have let go. She knew that, understood it logically, and it would not have made any difference to what her hands did in that moment, which was hold on with everything she had. He hit her twice, then something in her side that wasn't a punch. She registered the sensation, but not immediately the severity. That was something she remembered from her medic training, how adrenaline could sit in front of pain like a closed door. She was on the ground. She heard Corpsman. She heard something else, a voice from across the lot, someone shouting. She held the leash against her chest. He hit her again. Then Corpsman, who had been trained for patrol, trained for detection, trained for a dozen military applications, but never for this exact scenario, never for this particular kind of crisis, did something that the rescue organization would later say they had no framework to explain. He stopped trying to pull toward the man. He turned around. He pressed himself against Brianne's side, against the hand that was pressed against her ribs, and he stayed. The man ran. 2 other clinic employees had been walking out together and heard the commotion. One of them ran back inside to call 911 while the other crossed the lot at a sprint. Her name was Sandra Beaumont. She'd worked intake at the clinic for 6 years, and she would later tell police that when she got to Brianne, she was still holding the leash. Still holding it. The ambulance arrived in 9 minutes. The paramedics found Brianne Holt conscious with 3 stab wounds to her left side and 2 to her right arm. 5 total, a detail that would be repeated so many times in the days that followed that it started to lose its shape, become abstracted, until someone who hadn't been there would hear it and feel the weight of it fresh. Corpsman was still beside her. He did not allow the paramedics to approach until Brianne told him it was okay. And even then, he did not move more than 2 feet from her the entire time they worked. She was in surgery for 4 hours. Corpsman waited outside the OR. The hospital was not technically required to permit this. The surgical ward had its own policies about animals, reasonable policies, thoughtfully written. But the surgical team lead, a quiet woman named Dr. Kim Bassett, looked at the dog sitting outside the double doors and at the veteran he'd come in with, and made a call that had nothing to do with policy. She told the staff to let him wait. He sat there for all 4 hours. Didn't move to the water they set out for him. Didn't lie down. Just sat facing the doors. Brianne came out of surgery at 1014 in the morning. When they wheeled her through those doors and he saw her, something went out of his body. Some tension that had been winding tighter for hours, and he put his head on the edge of the gurney and closed his eyes. The story would have ended there, in a hallway, quietly, if not for Marcus Trell. Marcus Trell was 41, black, originally from Biloxi, Mississippi, and he had served as a Navy SEAL for 14 years before a training accident left him with a shattered right knee and a medical discharge that he'd never quite made peace with. He now ran a veteran support network called Still Standing out of New Orleans, which coordinated everything from job placement to mental health resources to housing assistance for veterans who'd come home and found the ground softer than they'd expected. He heard about Brianne Holt at 6 in the morning the day after the attack through a text from Sandra Beaumont, who had his number because her nephew was in the network. He read the text once. Then he sat with it for about 4 minutes. Then he made a phone call. By 8:30, he had called 41 people. By noon, he had over 200 confirmed. He didn't call it anything. Didn't name it, didn't post about it, didn't send a press release, just called person after person, SEALs, Rangers, Marines, Army medics, Air Force pilots, a few Navy corpsmen who'd served with people he'd served with, and said some version of the same thing each time. There's a combat vet and former medic in Hammond who got stabbed 5 times, holding onto her service dog so some guy couldn't take him. She's in the hospital. I'm going tomorrow. You coming? Almost everyone said yes. There were 217 people in the lobby, hallway, and parking lot of Our Lady of the Lakes Regional Medical Center in Hammond by 10 o'clock the next morning. Some had driven through the night. A man named Graves had flown in from Seattle and rented a car at the airport at 5 a.m. Two brothers, both former Marines, one missing his right hand, had driven up from Corpus Christi, Texas, a 12-hour drive without stopping except for gas. They were quiet. That was what the hospital staff would talk about afterward. Not the number, but the silence. Over 200 people and almost no noise. No signs, no chants, nothing performative. Most of them stood or sat in whatever space they could find. Some in uniform, some not. Some with service dogs of their own. A few were in wheelchairs. Dr. Bassett, coming in for her morning shift, walked through the lobby and stopped. She stood there for a moment. Then she found Marcus Trell, who was leaning against the wall near the main desk, and asked him who he was and what this was. He told her. She nodded slowly. She said, "I'll let her know." When the nurse, a young man named Timothy who had been assigned to Brianne's post-surgical care and had already decided she was the most uncomplaining patient he'd encountered in 3 years of nursing, went into her room and told her what was in the lobby, she looked at him for a long moment. She said, "How many?" He said, "Over 200, ma'am." She turned her face toward the window. Outside, it was a bright Louisiana morning, the kind with too much light and no wind. Corpsman was beside the bed, the hospital having quietly abandoned the rest of their animal policy sometime around 3 a.m. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Can someone bring them coffee?" Timothy laughed before he could stop himself. She wasn't strong enough to walk down on her own. The surgery had been extensive, and Dr. Bassett was firm about the next 24 hours, but they wheeled her to the elevator and down to the first floor, Corpsman walking beside the chair with his head high. When the elevator doors opened into the lobby, the first thing she saw was the size of it. She hadn't been prepared for the size of it. 200 people taking up every available space, and somehow, immediately, they all knew she was there without anyone having to announce it. It got very quiet. Then it got loud, not chaotic, not overwhelming, but the specific loud of 200 people standing up at the same time, some of them clapping, some of them just standing, a few pressing a hand to their chest in the way that means something different when a veteran does it. Corpsman looked out at all of them, and his tail moved, just once, a slow, deliberate sweep. Brianne Holt had not cried in 4 years. She would later say, when asked about this moment, that she wasn't crying then either. She would say this with complete conviction, even though every person in that lobby, including Marcus Trell, who was not a man easily moved, would describe her face in those first seconds in a way that told a different story. What she said, when she finally found her voice, was, "You didn't have to do this." Ann Trell, standing near the front, said, "Neither did you." The man who had attacked her was arrested 36 hours after the incident at a bus station in Baton Rouge. He had a record: 2 prior assaults, one involving a theft from a veteran's home in Mississippi, and was being held without bail while the DA's office worked through charges that, by the time they were done, would include aggravated battery, attempted robbery, and several additional counts that Brianne's attorney had suggested and the DA had agreed with. He would not, in any reasonable reading of the trajectory, be out of custody before Brianne's hair went gray. She would spend 11 more days in the hospital. Corpsman spent all of them with her. The hospital had, by that point, stopped trying to locate their animal policy. Dr. Bassett had told Timothy to tell anyone who asked that the dog was a documented medical necessity, and Timothy had said, with the particular precision of a new nurse who takes documentation seriously, "I'm not sure that's technically the right form." Dr. Bassett had said, "Find the right form." He had. On the day Brianne was discharged, Sandra Beaumont was waiting in the parking lot with a casserole that, by Sandra's own estimation, could feed 10 people. There were also 4 other clinic employees, 3 neighbors of Brianne's who'd found out about the story through the news coverage, which had been significant, and which Brianne had refused to participate in except for one written statement issued through her attorney, and Marcus Trell, who had driven down from New Orleans for no particular reason he could articulate except that he'd wanted to see it. She came out in the wheelchair, per hospital policy, and stood up at the edge of the sidewalk and looked at all of them. She said, "You people are too much." It came out sounding like the truest compliment she'd ever given. Corpsman pressed his weight against her left leg. She reached down without looking, and her hand found the top of his head, the scar along his right ear. He leaned into it. The thing about good partnerships, the kind that get built in hard places, between people or between a person and an animal who have each decided the other one is worth staying next to, is that they don't make much noise. They don't need to. They are legible in small gestures. A hand finding a head in the dark. A dog facing a door for 4 hours. An exhale in a hallway at 1:14 in the morning that sounds, to anyone listening, exactly like relief. She had gone into that parking lot on a Thursday evening intending nothing more than to get to her truck and go home. She had held on to a leash because letting go had not felt like an option. Because there are things a person carries through 11 years of combat medicine and 2 tours and an IED on a road outside a city, she can no longer think about without seeing it. And one of those things, one of the things you carry if you are that kind of person, is the particular understanding that some things are worth holding. She'd always known this. She'd just needed, on that particular evening, a parking lot and a man who underestimated her to demonstrate it. Corpsman walked beside her to Sandra Beaumont's car, where Sandra had also thought to put a folded blanket on the back seat because she'd read somewhere that dogs liked having something soft to lie on. He jumped in, turned around once, and lay down. Brianne got in beside him. The door closed. They went home. I keep thinking about the leash. Not the hospital, not the 217 people standing in that lobby, not even the dog sitting outside those OR doors for 4 hours straight, just the leash. The fact that when everything went sideways in that parking lot, when the pain hit and the ground came up fast, Brianne Holt's hands didn't open. She didn't calculate it. She didn't decide. She just held on. Because that's what you do when something matters to you. And somewhere in 11 years of combat medicine and everything that came after, she'd built the kind of character that doesn't release its grip just because releasing would be easier. That's the part that stays with me. We talk about courage like it's a decision you make in a calm moment, something you can plan for. But I think real moral fiber, the kind that actually counts, lives in the body before it lives in the mind. It shows up in what your hands do before your brain catches up. Brianne didn't hold on because she reasoned through it. She held on because of everything she already was. And then there's Marcus Trell. He heard about this at 6 in the morning through a secondhand text, and by noon he had 200 people confirmed. I want to sit with that for a second. He didn't have an app, didn't run a campaign, didn't post anything. He just picked up the phone and called people one at a time and said, "Someone worth showing up for needs people to show up." That's not logistics. That's a kind of intelligence about human beings, about what communities are actually for, about how to translate feeling something into doing something. He understood that grief and outrage and loyalty don't mean anything if they stay internal. You have to move them into the world. What I take from this, what I genuinely carry with me, is that these 3 things always travel together when something real happens. The character to hold on when letting go would cost you nothing. The clarity to understand what the moment is actually asking of you, and the endurance to stay in it, whether that's 4 hours outside an OR door, a 12-hour drive from Texas, or 11 years of keeping yourself together after a road outside Kandahar tried to take everything. Corpsman spent 4 hours facing those doors. Nobody trained him to do that. Nobody told him to. He just knew where he was supposed to be, and he stayed there. I think about that a lot. About how sometimes the clearest demonstration of all 3 of those things comes from the creature who can't even articulate them. He just lived them, completely, without hesitation. Sandra Beaumont ran across that parking lot. Dr. Bassett told a nurse to find the right form. 2 brothers drove through the night from Corpus Christi. None of them were obligated. All of them showed up anyway. That's the whole story, really. Not just Brianne's, everyone's. You build something in the quiet years, in the hard years, in the years when nobody is watching and there's no parking lot and no crisis, and it's just you deciding, over and over, what kind of person you're going to be. And then one evening the moment arrives, and your hands already know what to do.